Which government would deliberately weaken its own currency? No one, except China. So why did China deliberately weaken it? Because what China did was not a simple mistake. It was a calculated strategy designed to benefit itself enormously. A strategy so powerful that it changed the flow of global trade. China's strategy unlocked one of the most influential economic shifts of the last 40 years, turning the rules of the game in its own favor. It put enormous pressure on America's industry and economy, and it quietly reshaped the daily lives of not just Americans, but millions of people around the world. So why would China willingly and intentionally weaken its own currency? And how did doing so turn it into a massive economic superpower? The story begins like this. By the late 1970s, China had just emerged from Mao's harsh communist era. The country was exhausted and poor, factories were outdated, technology was weak, and the people barely surviving the previous era were living at very low income levels. At the same time, China was transitioning from a closed-off economic system to a new, young system that wanted to open up to the world. China wanted to take its place in this global transformation, and by making the right strategic moves, improve the comfort and prosperity of its people. At that exact turning point, Deng Xiaoping stepped onto the stage. His goal was simple. If China wanted to have a say in the new global economic system, it needed rapid industrialization. But he faced a massive problem. China wasn't the only country trying to seize global opportunities. There were dozens of competitors, and many of them were already far ahead. China, on the other hand, was just at the starting line. Its products were low quality, its production capacity weak, its workforce unskilled and inexperienced. The situation was obvious. How can we compete with other countries under these conditions? And right at that moment, China identified the key issue and found the solution. No matter what the product was, China had to make it the cheapest in the world. But achieving this wasn't simply about low wages or cheap raw materials. Even though those were part of the plan, the real weapon was the currency itself. China needed to change the value of the yuan. If the yuan were strong, every product manufactured in China would be more expensive globally. But China did not want that. Its entire strategy depended on supplying everything the world wanted, at the lowest possible price. If the yuan was valuable, China would lose the economic advantage it needed before its industrial development had even begun. So China made a decision the world wasn't expecting, a decision economists initially called economic suicide. China would keep the yuan weak, deliberately, at all costs. Normally, when a country grows and creates value, its currency strengthens. But China didn't want that outcome. So the central bank constantly intervened in the market. Whenever demand for dollars increased, it bought dollars and sold yuan. As a result, the yuan was always abundant in the market, and anything in excess supply loses value. So, the yuan stayed weak. This created a fascinating paradox. A strong country's currency normally gets stronger, but China produced more, exported more, and built more value, yet its currency got weaker. This was the opposite of how a typical economy functions, but China's plan was the opposite of a typical economy, and by keeping the yuan weak, it turned that weakness into an engine of growth. As this mechanism kept working, factories expanded, Walmart shelves in America filled with Chinese products. The American public, already enjoying strong purchasing power thanks to the strong dollar, now had access to an endless wave of cheap China-made goods. China turned into a factory that produced everything America and the world wanted, at extremely low prices. But behind this visible scene, a much larger economic transformation was unfolding. America's industrial zones began shutting down, one after another, because they simply could not compete with such cheap goods. Chinese products pushed local producers out of the market wherever they went. Manufacturing collapsed in many countries. It didn't matter which one. Meanwhile, China stored every single dollar it earned in the reserves of its central bank. And the game became even more clever. China began lending those very dollars back to the United States to finance Washington's deficits. So the cycle looked like this. America bought cheap goods from China. America paid China in dollars. China saved those dollars. China used the same dollars to buy US government bonds. Then America used the borrowed money again to buy more goods from China. A loop that was beneficial for China and increasingly dangerous for America. In normal economics courses in schools and universities, this would be described as a contradiction. But China saw an opportunity no one else anticipated. And it gave China enormous power. Because cheap currency meant cheap production. Cheap production bought China time. And during that time, China built everything it needed to dominate global trade: ports, logistics networks, factories, energy infrastructure. In short, all the foundations needed for long-term competitiveness. China was no longer just a country producing cheap goods. It became the center of the world's entire production chain. The Western world, especially America, misread this picture for years. They viewed themselves as strong because their currency was strong, and they ignored China because its currency was weak. They kept believing a weak currency means weakness. While they slept, China stayed loyal to its strategy. It ignored all criticism. In a way, it weaponized the perception of weakness and gained the power to build an economic empire. By keeping its currency weak, China wasn't just exporting goods. It was buying the most important thing of all: time. How does a country control the value of its currency? Is this really manipulation? Or is it simply playing by the rules of the game? Here's how China pulled it off, and how its currency stayed weak even as its manufacturing exploded. How a country really controls its currency. Controlling the value of a currency sounds simple. If you want it low, you push it down. If you want it high, you push it up. But it's not that easy. China did something extremely difficult. Instead of fighting the market, it became the market. To understand what that means, you first need to know something. A currency rises or falls based solely on supply and demand. In free market economies like the US and Europe, currencies float naturally. Germany doesn't interfere with the euro. Japan doesn't constantly force the yen. The UK lets the pound move on its own. But China could not afford a free market. If it allowed the yuan to float naturally, its currency would strengthen as the economy grew, and China's entire cheap goods strategy would collapse. So China did something that very few nations in history have attempted. It adopted a fixed exchange rate system. In this system, the Chinese state declares, "This is the price of the yuan." And no matter what happens, no matter what markets think or how much demand increases, the yuan does not change value. To do this, China had to take on an enormous responsibility. Whenever anyone wanted to buy or sell yuan against dollars, euros, yen, China itself became the buyer or seller. Someone wants yuan and wants to pay dollars. They get it directly from the Chinese state. Someone wants to sell yuan and get dollars. Again, they deal with the Chinese state. This required massive reserves, something that looked impossible at first. But time gave China the answer. China spent decades accumulating every dollar it earned from exports. To outsiders, these reserves looked like savings. But in reality, they were ammunition used to keep the yuan artificially weak. If the market tried to push the yuan upward, China immediately bought dollars and sold yuan. This forced the yuan back down. In other words, the government intervened in the supply-demand balance and prevented the yuan from appreciating. This tactic looked simple on the surface, but economically it carried a very heavy cost. To carry out these interventions, China constantly needed massive amounts of foreign currency, especially US dollars. From the outside, the yuan looked stable. But inside the country, every intervention functioned like a hidden tax on the Chinese economy. How? When a country imports goods, a weak currency makes those goods more expensive because its own currency buys less. This weakened the purchasing power of the Chinese public and made some products harder to access. So yes, in order to sell cheap goods to the world, China was deliberately keeping its own people's consumption levels lower. That sounds uncomfortable, and it is. But China's goal wasn't short-term comfort, it was long-term power. To secure tomorrow's prosperity, it sacrificed today's desires. So why doesn't anyone else use this system? Why is China the only country that did this successfully? Because this strategy only works if a nation has an enormous labor force, enormous production capacity, constant inflows of foreign currency, and a highly disciplined state structure. Most developing countries would lose control of their currency entirely if they tried this. They simply don't have what China has: 1.4 billion workers, a gigantic industrial base, and a non-stop stream of dollars entering the system. China's strategy wasn't about breaking the rules. It embedded its own rule into the global game. The key point of this strategy: by deliberately keeping its currency weak, China didn't just create a price advantage. It rewrote the mathematics of global trade. Without this, China's rapid industrialization would have been impossible. Why did the West become angry at China for using this strategy? While China was keeping its currency artificially low, it was also quietly reshaping itself internally. But this transformation required time, and during that time the harshest effects were not felt in China, but in America and Europe. Because a cheap yuan didn't just make Chinese goods inexpensive, it shattered the production model of the West. At this point, the issue stopped being economics. Throughout history, from ancient Rome to modern nations, the power to produce is what keeps a nation alive. Production equals strategic power. Over time, American and European manufacturers began to realize, no matter what we do, we cannot match China's prices. The price gap was far too big to explain through technology, efficiency, or quality. China's weak currency acted like an invisible discount on every product, so the West's reaction was not economic, it was strategic. For years, the US held this view. China is disrupting global trade. By keeping its currency artificially low, it is destroying our manufacturing sector. Because when one side collapses, the other side rises. China's rise was pressuring the balance of power America was used to. And China wasn't just making cheap toys or household items. It was taking over everything. Electronics, steel, textiles, automotive industrial components, strategic materials, even the smallest battery or spare part. As sectors became increasingly China-centric, the West's production muscles atrophied. Imports increased, domestic production decreased, unemployment grew in some regions, and skilled labor disappeared. The issue was clear: China's power was no longer purely economic. It was a strategic advantage essential to national survival. When one country controls most of the world's production, it also becomes more influential in global decision-making. So, America began seeing China's weak currency strategy not as a price ploy, but as a long-term power move. A China-centered production network was forming, and this network behaved like a spider web, waiting patiently as its prey wandered deeper into dependence. The West was becoming trapped and couldn't break free. There was one more reason for the backlash. China was taking the dollars it earned and turning around to invest them in US Treasury bonds, essentially lending money to America so the US could finance its own expenses. In short, China was financing America's debt. Economically, this made sense. Geopolitically, it was deeply unsettling, because a country can be your rival, yet at the same time your lender, and that combination can become dangerous at any moment. To describe it simply, through its production dominance, China already had one hand on America's throat, and by financing America's debt, it placed its second hand there too, a position where, theoretically, it could squeeze at any moment. This dilemma raised a question in Washington. Does economic dependence eventually turn into political dependence? The West's anger grew directly from this fear. China appeared to be merely keeping its currency weak. But behind the scenes, it was altering global power dynamics. It was becoming a game maker, rewriting the rules in ways no one expected. Industrial dominance, massive financial reserves, rising geopolitical influence. All of it was built on a long-term strategy rooted in a deliberately weak currency. So if everything was going so well for China, why did China abandon this strategy? What did it replace it with? And where is the yuan heading in today's global monetary system? For decades, China built its growth on a weak currency, a strategy few countries could ever sustain. It executed it with such discipline that China didn't just expand its production capacity. It positioned itself at the center of global supply chains. But here's the twist. China eventually began phasing out the very system it created. Why? Because China had finally reached a stage where it no longer needed to be the world's cheap factory. It had built all the infrastructure, industry, supply chains, and production muscle it required. And now, there were almost no rivals left who could compete with its manufacturing power. So beginning in 2005, China allowed the yuan to appreciate in a controlled manner. This shift had three major reasons. 1. China no longer needed ultra-cheap pricing. It had already become the factory of the world. Its production capacity was so massive, even unrivaled in some sectors, that it could lower costs through scale, not through a weak currency. 2. The weak currency strategy eventually triggered strong backlash from the West. Trade wars, tariffs, sanctions. These were becoming costly for China. So China wanted to escape the equation. Weak currency equals political risk. Strengthening the yuan gradually was a strategic move. 3. China aimed to take on a bigger role in global finance. A weak currency with a low credibility image couldn't achieve that. For the yuan to become a financial asset, it needed stability and trust. This is why China succeeded in joining the IMF's reserve currency basket in 2016. The message was clear. The yuan will not only power production, it will also play in global finance. But China didn't fully abandon its old strategy. It simply changed the method. And this is exactly where the West's new anger begins. Because this is no longer just currency policy, it's the new battleground of global industrial competition. China is now expanding sector by sector, using the production muscle it built during the weak yuan decades. The playing field has changed, but the logic remains the same. Short-term sacrifice, long-term dominance. So, what is the future of the yuan? China knows it cannot disrupt the dollar's dominance with a single move. Its goal is much longer term. More trade, conducted in yuan. More countries integrating into China's financial system. Digital yuan systems reducing dependency on the dollar. China doesn't just want to be the country that produces. It wants to be the country that settles accounts. Being the center of production was one kind of power. Being a financial center is a completely different power. China's weak currency strategy served as a ladder. It climbed that ladder, and now it has stepped onto a new platform. Just as America once embedded the dollar into the global system, China weakened the yuan to build its own power structure. And China's rise affects America more than anyone else. Because for decades, the United States sat alone at the center of the global economy, controlling production, finance, reserve currency, and trade networks. China's ascent added a new center beside it, so the U.S. now realizes it can no longer remain the single uncontested leader it once was. For America, this is both an opportunity and a threat. If you liked it or found it helpful, you can subscribe, like, or share. The choice is yours. See you in the next video.